In our last chapter for this week on person perception, we want to talk a little bit about bias in person perception. We want to use beauty as one of these powerful signals in the way we perceive others, the attractiveness of another person that systematically leads us to misperceive and misrepresent who these people are and what they are capable of doing. And I think obviously, the first thing that comes to mind when we talk about attractiveness or beauty is mating, right? We think about, okay, finding a partner is like a really important task that we all face, right? I think most of us are really interested in finding somebody, having a partner, spending time and forming long-term relationships. So you might be even as crazy as me and get married and have children, right? And so for most of us, this is basically a part of the human experience, and finding the difficulties of finding somebody is one part of being a human, right? You have to find somebody that you like, that you trust, that you can have fun with, and so forth. So what are the signals we're using? Obviously, you won't be really surprised if I tell you that the attractiveness is in the dating market a really important aspect, but I think it's often underappreciated how important it is. So let me give you a cheesy example here to kind of highlight that, right? We talked about kind of a lot of like movie heroes and villains, and this is, I want to use some of these again to illustrate it. So there's, in one of the most successful animes in the history of animes, there are these two characters in the beginning, or like they dominate the storyline. And that is on the left, there's you see Sasuke Uchiha, and Sasuke is this like attractive, at least that's what the girls think in the anime, this attractive boy who's a little bit of a jerk, right? But the girls all swoon over him and they all want to really date him. And then on the other side, on the right, there's Naruto Uzumaki, who is the main character, who's somewhat goofy and is not as attractive as Sasuke, and has a really hard time convincing anyone to be romantically interested in him. Okay. So there's this one person in particular that she is in love with Sasuke here on the left, and Naruto is in love with her, and she doesn't even kind of consider him as a potential mate because he just physically doesn't seem to appeal to her. But Sasuke, who constantly acts like an ass towards her, who's not very nice to her, says a lot of mean things, she still keeps on being interested. Here, why am I telling you that? I mean, this is just like kind of rehearsing a similar story, like a familiar story. Okay, so here it seems like the only thing that matters for the person in love is the physical attraction, right? How that person looks. So is this actually the case, right? One thing we often kind of think here is like, oh, this is something that is particularly important for men, not for women. Men are more visual. Is that actually true? Okay. So if you look, here's a study by Eli Finkel and others, and what they find is that actually physical attractiveness is as important as physical attractiveness is as important as a predictor of dating behavior for men and for women. The clever thing is that they kind of dissociate in these studies between, and we will come to this when we talk about attitudes, between the implicit and explicit attitudes. For now, it is sufficient to say that you can think of these as implicit attitudes as like your kind of emotional reactions towards seeing something, towards seeing somebody attractive. So it's basically how you respond to an implicit to a picture of an attractive person versus an unattractive person, and your explicit things is what you're saying. So men and women in the study say like, okay, it's really important that the other person is educated. It's really important that the other person is friendly, funny, etc. for dating, and attractiveness might matter too. Women say it matters less than men. So when asked, they explicitly say, oh, this is less important for me, and men say like, this is more important for me. But then if you look at their actually decisions whom to date out of this pool of potential mates, of potential dating partners, then you can see that for men and women, attractiveness is the most influential factor. And despite of what women claim here in this study, right, saying like, oh, it's less important for me how the partner looks. So you can say, okay, for the dating market, I think there's tons and tons of research on that, showing again and again that the most important factor for us, even though we might feel differently, and this might change maybe in long-term relation once you're in a long-term relationship, but the most important factor is physical attractiveness. Okay. We'll come back to this, why this might be the case, but you might think like, okay, fair enough. Romantic love, I don't know. There seems to be something, it kind of makes sense that we are interested in attractive people, and, or at least we're physically interested in them, right? But it's important to say that the kind of attractiveness and beauty advantage doesn't just stop with dating, right? Here on the left, we talked about this yesterday. We talked about this in our earlier videos about that basically people who are look more baby-faced, are more attractive, are less likely to be sentenced and receive less harsh punishment than people who like criminals who are more attractive, right? So more attractive criminals receive less punishment for the same deeds. And this is often also, it's like one thing that I thought is often interesting, often even is much more powerful than racial differences in judging, right? So there's a tendency by judges, because they're part of society, to kind of use their racial stereotypes in order to let them influence their judgments. But attractiveness is another really important factor, and some suggest a much more important factor, for instance, in sentencing than race. So it seems like if you are attractive and you commit a crime, okay, it's good to be attractive there. The same as for job interviews. It seems like there's a long kind of the beauty privilege, the beauty premium. People who are more attractive earn more money, they're more likely to be hired. Right? So it's kind of like if you are like basically not to your, it's like born in a certain way, looking either attractive or, I mean, it's better to say judged by society to look attractive or unattractive, this makes a major difference in your life. Again, I think I just want to stress this. These are marginal differences, right? It's obviously important. It's not the most important factor. If you are applying for a job, your qualities matter more, right? If you're not qualified to do the job, then no matter how attractive you are, this will not like change that. But if you have the same, for instance, qualifications and experience as another person, and you might be in a fortunate position to be more attractive than the other person, then this gives you potentially the marginal edge to get this position. As you can imagine, each of these fields gets more complicated the more you drill into it. And we will do this in a second and try to kind of explain what is going on. But in general, I think what psychology suggests is that there is this halo effect. So there's the attractiveness halo effect, but there's in general a halo effect. And the halo effect, I think it was like discovered in the 1930s by Thorndike. And what he finds is that if I judge you to be intelligent, then I will also be more likely to judge you as funny. I will also be more likely to judge you as attractive, as trustworthy, and so forth. So it seems like that once you are good on one dimension, it's like, oh, this guy's funny. Now he becomes attractive, more intelligent, more trustworthy, and so forth, right? And this is what we call the halo effect, that one positive aspect that we kind of prescribe to another person then impacts my evaluation of all the others. And this seems to be also going on with kind of like what's called the attractiveness halo effect. I think that's a term phrased by Eagly. I have not put his references here, but basically says like, okay, here the attractiveness is, the halo effect is instigated by the attractiveness. And so Sebrovitz and others, they kind of argue that basically, why is this the case, right? So if you see two people, if you see here, for instance, it's Buscemi on the right, on our account, Steve Buscemi, he's a famous actor, lives in New York, seems to be a really lovely guy, right? So I would just suspect that most people think he's not as attractive as Aaron Hernandez on the left. right? He's a football player. And I'll tell you in a second why it shows these two pictures. But the idea here of Zebrovnitz and others is that basically ugliness is somewhat related to kind of genetic deformation. So we think about this somewhat resembles that there's something genetically not quite right with the person, and hence it makes us less attracted to them, okay? And we also thereby feel like now this halo effect comes into, so I see a face that somehow evolutionary resonates with me and says like, oh, this is more likely to be a person that might carry some disease. It might not be as good as a mating partner to produce offspring, and that kind of is the reason why I think like, oh, he's ugly and he is not, okay? And that then influences your perception of his trustworthiness, intelligence, competence, and so forth, and all the other dimensions. That's when the halo effect kind of unfolds, right? The reason I often kind of like when I in other contexts start talk about the halo effect, I ask people, whom do you think is more likely to judge who you think is more likely to have committed a double murder, right? And these are two celebrities here, Aaron Hernandez and Steve Buscemi. Once you talk about it, people become like, okay, the listener become a little bit more how do I like suspicious, and they all say like, oh, it's probably the attractive guy, and that's right. He was a famous American football player who killed two people, I think out of kind of revenge or something, or they disrespected him or something like that. Quite a strange story. Okay. But here you can see that we're often misguided, right, by these impressions, and one part of this explanation is the halo effect. It's important to also kind of give a little bit nuance here. I think I'm kind of blocking it. This is research by Eagly and others. But basically what this meta-analysis shows is that, and yes, what it shows is that the beauty is good and genre works, but it also depends a little bit on the context, right? We talked about this in the earlier videos. Context matters. And the one example, for instance, that I cited for scientists, it doesn't seem to be good to be attractive. Here, if you think that a scientist is attractive, you might be more interested in hearing more about her research, but you might feel it's less believable or trustworthy, right? So in this research by Eagly and others, what they basically find is often that the social components, so if you look at these two attractive people, then you think like, oh my God, they are probably really funny and easy to talk to, etc. So the social components matter more for the halo effect. And then I think, for instance, competence is often more a null effect, which seems to suggest that in some contexts we might even, as a scientist, penalize people for their attractiveness. So it's not all attributes where we think, oh, she's beautiful, so she must be. So the halo effect needs to be a little bit differentiated, and it kind of depends a little bit on the roles and the context we see the other person. Okay. But just to kind of like, that's the main idea. It's good, but right here, what is beautiful, good, but it needs to be a little bit more differentiated, right? And so one of these kind of things we talked a little bit about was trying to understand, okay, the three different approaches. I see, for instance, a person, and now I might use the cue of attractiveness in order to kind of judge whether she's trustworthy, whether she's competent, whether she would be a good mother, a good scientist, or somebody good for your group work, right? So here on the left, we had the cognitive miser, and Susan Fiske and Shelley Taylor would say like, yes, this is like a lazy way of thinking. You use a kind of superficial stimuli, and then it's just like, oh, she looks competent, right? You don't question yourself why you make that judgment. So the halo effect can be kind of like in full blow here, right? On the other hand, here in the right corner, you have the motivated cognition. So motivated cognition, remember, means that you want to believe certain things, right? And I think here is often that what we can see is that people really want to believe that beautiful people, for instance, are good people. It seems to help to kind of maintain this belief in a just world. Okay, so this is the idea that good people deserve good things, so the good people are the attractive people, right? Think about movies, especially children movies. There's always like the witch is evil and ugly versus the like the princess is good and beautiful, right? And so this is kind of like the just world where the ugly people, they get all the bad things and the good looking people get all the good things. So we might be motivated to kind of keep in that belief that there's some just system in the world, and hence the good people get the good stuff. And so this is something that motivated cognition would suggest. One thing that I want to kind of in the last bit focus a little bit on is this idea of kind of using biases and heuristics, right? And so heuristic would be kind of like, oh, I have to figure out whether this job applicant is a good job applicant, or I have to figure out if this would be a good partner or a bad partner, right? And so what Kahneman and Tversky say is that we often use something that's called representative heuristic. And I think the representative heuristic has a kind of the most explanatory power in this context, because it tells us a little bit like, depending on the context, I use different representative to judge that. So let me try to explain that a little bit in detail and then apply it again to the beauty effect. So the representative heuristics is basically, it's very, very simple, right? You're trying to figure out, oh, for instance, is Andreas a good scientist? So what you do is like, you have this idea of how a good scientist should look like, okay? The good scientist should probably not wear like a black hoodie while talking on this. Okay, so I'm a little bit of suspect of Andreas, right? You might think about, how should a politician look like? How does an athlete look like, right? And then you kind of use this, you have this prototype, and then you judge basically how close or how far somebody is of that prototype, and then you judge the likelihood of that, okay? So here's one classic study where they kind of test that. It's a very, like all of these are very often very, established phenomenon. But you're trying to figure out, okay, let's say you're trying to figure out whether Bob is a farmer or he plays in a major symphony orchestra, right? So you hear it's like Bob is an opera fan who enjoys touring art museums when on holiday. Growing up, he enjoyed playing chess with family members and friends. Which situation is more likely? Bob plays trumpet for a major symphony orchestra and Bob is a farmer, okay? So the reason why it's set up like that is like the person, Bob sounds like a person that would be play a trumpet on a major symphony orchestra. Bob doesn't really sound like somebody that represents to us what a farmer would be like, right? But the trick here is a little bit like if you ask what's much more likely, I think it's much more likely that he's a farmer than he plays on a major symphony orchestra, just because I think there are probably in the US maybe 5 people who play the trumpet for a symphony orchestra. So it's very hard, very rare, whereas there are literally millions of farmers. So it's much more likely that Bob is a farmer who's a little bit unusual for what we think represents a farmer, but that we are misguided by this. People think A is much more likely than B. And so we're trying to kind of assess, okay, does he look like something that we think of when we think of farmer or when we think of a symphony orchestra, right? So now you can kind of think about, if you like these differentiated effects, you can think, okay, for mating, right? If you think about who is the perfect partner for us, and what we kind of learn, but also what seems to be somewhat innate in us, is that we think of attractive people are the best kind of people to spend our time with as romantic partners, right? So they're very representative of, for instance, romantic partners, of like somebody that would make us happy, that we would be happy with. They might also be kind of like come up when we think about people who are socially fun, who would we enjoy spending time with, right? But then I think if we think about, for instance, a scientist, if we would have to judge these two beautiful people here and say like, okay, how likely is it that one of them is a scientist? Then we might come up and say like, I don't know, right? They seem pretty far off from my stereotypical idea about a scientist. If you kind of look at the how most of your lecturers look like and then compare them to these two, you feel like, yeah, I'm not sure if our lecturers quite match that. And some of you might feel like, well, they might not be really good scientists. So here you can see this dissociation, and I think the representative heuristic has the power to explain why in certain areas attractiveness as a cue might be really powerful, right? And it might be less powerful in other contexts, right? You can think about the courtyard, or so like the court where I have to judge whether one of these two people is good or bad, right? And you think like, oh, how do bad people look like? Okay, bad people look like what I learned in movies about like these like the evil witch, right? And okay, they don't look like that, and so I use it. Obviously this is not a conscious thought process, but this is what your mind does. Okay, so I think that kind of helps us to understand a little bit how we use certain clues, and you can replace beauty or other thing with other things, right? And to kind of make sense of other people and how it shapes the way we perceive others. I want to kind of highlight two other biases that I quite liked, that I just want to kind of end with what I started, and this is Darth Vader, right? So Darth Vader is kind of like a curious story in some ways, right? He basically starts out good. I think he's Anakin Skywalker. He's good. He has the force is strong. The power, his magical power with him is really strong. All the hopes are with him. And then he gets corrupted to the dark side. He becomes what you see in front of you. They built the Death Star. They kill billions of people with the Death Star. He does it. He does it willingly. He does it without showing any remorse. He's a kind of a hunter of the rebels. He kills rebels, and he doesn't seem to have a conscience. But then he meets his son Luke again and has kind of like a turn of heart. He rediscovers his old values from like, I don't know, 50 years ago, and helps to kind of overthrow the evil emperor, right? And I think there's like, I want to use this story. And so, and some at the end, which I think is so interesting, at the end, he basically dies and then he goes into Jedi heaven. So it seems like that his final act redeemed him. And while killing billion people, you kind of feel like, yeah, whatever. But at the end, you did something good. So off you go to Jedi heaven. And I think it's interesting in some ways because there are two effects, psychological effects that you already heard of, are here to kind of help us to explain it. Why are we willing to accept that? Why don't we think like, that's ridiculous? Why is he going to heaven? No, we don't think so. One of them is, okay, let's start with this, or maybe I can just like start with that we're supposed to come up first. So this is, I think you know, Ebbinghaus, Hermann Ebbinghaus, like forgetting curve, right? And you basically have this kind of effect where it's like, you have the primacy effect, the recency effect, and the intermediate, right? The primacy effect lets us remember the things that come first. The recency effect lets us remember the things that come last. And this is the reason why the Hollywood budget, if you have 100 million, you invest most of your in the opening sequence and in the end. This is what people remember, right? If you think of Darth Vader, what do you remember? We remember when we form impressions of others, the last thing, the most, and the first thing. So first things matter because they bias the way we like basically bias our subsequent memory. We are more likely to recall first impressions than impressions later on, but also recent impressions. So he does recently, first and recently, he does something really good, and in the middle he kills billions of people, but oopsie, forgot about it. So we're willing to kind of overweight this in our judgment. The other one in here on the right is like this idea what we talked about when we talk about Marc Piumont, right? About the true self, which we talked about last week. Here it is the idea that basically people think like they want to believe, they're motivated to believe and other people's true self is a good self, right? So we are really willing to accept that Darth Vader in his hearts of hearts and his true self is a good guy, right? So we have this openness to kind of accept this change. And then it's like, it's almost like, yes, I mean, you can think about like Christian religion, right? Where it's like you have on a deathbed, if you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, then basically everything will be forgotten, right? And you're fine and you can go into heaven, right? And this is a little bit like the same principle. It's all about timing. So if you do something really evil in your time in your life, then try to do it in the middle and not at the beginning of the end. So it's all about timing here. And then people do something nice at the end, and people will think that this act revealed your true self. All right. I'm looking forward to seeing your movies and stories someday coming out, and where you apply these findings and ideas and start to create compelling characters, or just observe yourself and the people around you and how you form impressions of them. All right, this is it for the week. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week and the readings, and see you soon.